Welcome to A Cult of Personality at occultofpersonality.net. Thank you for listening.
This is A Cult of Personality podcast, episode number 114, featuring an interview with internationally renowned philosopher and mystic Neil Kramer. I'm your host, Greg Kaminsky. Thank you for listening. Support for A Cult of Personality podcast comes from the subscribers to the A Cult of Personality membership section, as well as those generous listeners from all over the world who clicked the donate button on the occultofpersonality.net website to sponsor this episode. Thanks again to Trina, Chris, Neil, Michal from Slovakia, and especially Steve in the UK. Now, in podcast episode number 114, an interview with mystic, philosopher, and essayist Neil Kramer. You can find Neil online at neilkramer.com, as well as his previous appearance in A Cult of Personality podcast episode number 98. In this recording, Neil questions our perception of normality and consensus reality as he analyzes current events and the future that is being built. Bear in mind that we recorded this interview during the twilight of the summer of 2011, after the England riots in early August. But many of the issues addressed here are even more relevant in light of the economic and political crises in Europe, the Occupy movement in the United States, and the war escalation across the globe. Neil takes a very hard look at the situation from a perspective that is anything but typical. Neil Kramer, I want to welcome you back to A Cult of Personality podcast. It's a pleasure to speak with you once again.
Thank you, Greg. It's great to be here. Glad to contribute to your project. It's such a lot of interesting guests and such a wealth of information that it's good to be part of it. Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. And I know the listeners do as well. Let's see, since we last spoke, it seems like the external world, politically, economically, in a lot of very demonstrable ways, has seemingly been turned upside down. I don't think I have to go into citing all the events. We can just tick off some of the highlights: a tsunami, an earthquake in Japan, not to mention the consequent nuclear disaster, the unemployment situation in many countries, all of this debt that's been run up by banks and somehow transferred onto the backs of people, and not to mention the uprisings and violence in the Middle East. And it seems like things are escalating.
Indeed.
In your opinion, as a philosopher, as a mystic, as a visionary, as someone who investigates human consciousness and the human condition in general, what can you tell us about what's been happening and our relation to this preconception of normality that we like to hold on to?
Well, I think it begins by taking a look for a moment at what normality is, and what that means to people, both the mainstream people, if you like, and people who have chosen to walk a different path and be more sovereign and concentrate on their own unfoldment and esoteric studies and so on and so forth. I mean, normality, really, we have to kind of start to just contemplate what that actually is. And I think etymologically, you're seeing it really as a conforming to a standard. That's what it really is. It's a commonality. And it's also interesting to see that the sort of secondary term for that, this is quite fresh in my memory actually because I've been talking about it recently, is that it also serves to found and establish a standard. So normality is actually quite an important tool, I think, for any governing body, such as, obviously the United States and Europe and many of the Western powers. And we see it really as it's quite a humorous thing, really, for the people who move in the circles that you and I and your listeners do, in that normality is almost invariably something that one tends to push away from, and has always been a cause for concern, really, to some extent early on in one's unfoldment. And it is examining that normality and contemplating what it is that sends us to some degree on the path that we each walk. And in discussing what normal is, I have this conception that I teach and discuss and explore in the workshops that I give, of this kind of 7-dimensional universe, of these 7 densities or spheres or ethers or planes, things I'm sure you and your listeners are very accustomed to. And I just really formulate this into, it's just my personal understanding of how reality seems to hang together. And so you could say that we inhabit a 3rd density space within this model. And normality, a lot of people imagine that, well, normal is that 3-dimensional space. But I consider normality to be this incredibly thin sliver, this very single, narrow broadcast within that 3rd density. And then really, when you look at what it is, the most normal things are the things that we see on television, the sitcoms, the movies, shopping, gadgets, games, news, business, war, corporations, sport, all those different crazy things. That is what is normal. So if anyone were to come from another world and sit with me for a moment and say, explain what normal is, I'd say, well, just watch television for an hour or two and you'll get a good idea of what normal is supposed to be and what it is propagated as. And you look at this thing, and the deeper you look at it, certainly from a philosophical aspect, and then one would expect a spiritual slice to arise out of that, it becomes more and more absurd, this normality, the deeper you look at it. And if you really kind of stand at your center and stop referencing endlessly external things and just look at it from your own sort of truth and from your own open, integral vision, it is rather comical, really. It's as comical as it is disastrous in many ways. And certainly the more solemn stuff, when we are given the news, for example, so-called news, and all the doom and gloom and solemnity with which that's delivered, for me, just adds to the absurdity. And I think you can define it really by saying the strange thing about normal is you have to ask the question of who is making normal, who is fabricating it, who is manufacturing it, who is packaging it. And it is, obviously this leads one into slightly conspiratorial waters if you're not too careful. But you could say certainly there are institutes and foundations and think tanks and commissions and so on, many of which we probably are aware of. Doubtless many we're not aware of at all. And so Chatham House, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, Tavistock, the IMF, all these different organizations, and then the secret societies, which I don't need to go over that here. And a lot of those bodies manufacture normal, if you really look into it. Certainly in the 60s and 70s, it's quite clear to track that, because the media wasn't as fragmented as it is now. And so that transmission of normal, what I sometimes call the Unreality broadcast, just with a kind of, take that with a pinch of salt, but that Unreality broadcast, that measuring stick, derives from these organizations. And one way to think about it is to say, well, I don't contribute to what's normal in this world. If I walk around New York City, the images that I see that reflect normality are not anything that I would participate in. They're not anything that I have made. And if you extend that out, they're not anything that any of my friends or colleagues or family or anyone I've ever met has ever contributed to. And certainly the big resonators of normality stem from rather synthetic sources. So it seems to me that when you look at this, this thing that I call the construct, which is this very synthetic reality tunnel that is put forth as a filter, as a lens of looking at the world through, normality is a very important aspect of that. And it really, it keeps people on the straight and narrow, a government might say, and it keeps people from descending into lawlessness or some sort of wild abandon. And of course, when you look at questions of sovereignty and independence, even divinity, then that whole thing begins to dissolve somewhat. And so religion is offered up as the bridge between what is synthetic and what is organic. So those people are starting to figure out that the construct's view of normality is not fulfilling and is not entirely satisfying, and actually is rather dreary and repetitive. And if you're a sensitive person, it can be very soul-crushing. Then those people are offered a version of spirituality, which again is packaged very peculiar fashion as a religion, as priests basically who have this set of doctrines, whether it's Christian or Islamic or Judaic or whatever. And those priests are ordained, and somebody ordains them, and there's this lineage. And of course, when we trace the roots of these things, we see that they kind of like pinched a lot of their ideas from elsewhere. And the inner groups who do the interesting work are completely out of the sort of public domain anyway. So we're only dealing with the sort of exoteric shell of this. So the question of normality, when you probe it, is really a broadcast, and it's a broadcast of governance, essentially. And it has some fun aspects, of course, and because of the huge diversity and proliferation of media, we can say that there are some good things that come through normality, this broadcast, and some of the music and the arts and the more human aspects of culture certainly are rather interesting and good to look at. But taken on the whole, if you look at some of the most concerning aspects of normality, then we could say, well, let's imagine for a moment that we have these 52 weeks in the year, and for a lot of people, 48 of those weeks are given to something that they're not entirely inspired by, and that investment, that energy, is poured into something that is essentially just a mechanism to put food on the table, a roof over your head, and to heat you up or cool you down, and so on and so forth. And that there's obviously some common sense in that, but the ratio, that 90-odd% of giving our time away to something that is not an authentic way of behaving in most cases. There are some exceptions, of course, but for the vast majority of Europeans and Britons and Americans, normality really is a grind, and it is just not something that lifts the human